Well, welcome to Carnegie Town Hall on Tuesday, December 5th for our 4 o'clock informational meeting. The first order of business is a report from the Land Use Committee, and I will give that report for Councilor Selberg since he was absent on that particular day. Basically, the lone item that was presented to Land Use on November 21st, Tuesday, November 21st, was the topic of street lighting engineering design standard changes. And Nicholas Borns, and who's a principal engineer, and Jerry Jungling, light and power superintendent, presented to us approximately about 15 minutes. Presentation gave us a brief background on the project to revise the street lighting engineering design standards. And then we had just a little bit of open discussion, followed by adjournment at that point in time. Okay, our next item here is City Council open discussion. Do we have any items for open discussion? Councilor Staley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was able to go to a Wells Fargo presentation this morning, and I think this is an exciting program that they're launching, well, new to South Dakota. It's called the Neighborhood Lift Program. And for anyone who's interested in this, if you'd leave that up there, please. growsouthdakota.org is the website. Thank you, Tony. What this is Wells Fargo has given grants to different states in a total of $353 million to help people with the down payment for a home, which I think is a wonderful thing. They have come to South Dakota, and they're offering $2 million of grant money to a total of 224 people. And you start by going to this website and doing the paperwork or the online registration. And you do have to go through some formalities. They want you to spend 8 hours of home buyer's education. They have it's 80% of the median income to qualify for this, $7,500. And if you live in your home for 5 years, it's totally forgiven. If you do decide to move, they prorate it 20% a year. So I think it's a wonderful program, and again, anyone who's interested in thinking of buying a home, which is what they think home ownership is important, and I do as well, growsd.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other items for open discussion? Okay, seeing none, then we'll move right into our presentations this afternoon. First presentation is a quarterly city administration building update by Director of Central Services, Sue Quanbeck-Etten. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you. Here to give you a quarterly update on the progress of our construction on the City Administration Building. Start with just going through the milestones to date. As you know, in January of this year, we broke ground. In April, we executed GMP, and we hope to have the building fully enclosed very soon, this month, especially after yesterday, just kind of makes us want to have it enclosed as quickly as possible with the wind and the snow that we had yesterday. So we're almost there, and we should be there later this month. By May, the building should be substantially complete, and then in July, Van Epps Parks as well. And as you know, we are updating Van Epps Park as part of this project, and the landscaping will be beautiful. In October, we conducted tours for City Council, for city staff, and the media. And very well attended tours. It's kind of fun to get inside of the structure and look around to get a sense of what the building's going to actually be like. Current construction activity includes, like I said, the building exterior, and we're almost there, including the brick, the quartzite panels, which I think will look very nice, windows and glass. Our main roof is complete, and we're working on the wall framing, sheetrock, and insulation. This is kind of a cool picture from the inside of the installation of the stair structures in the atrium. There will be stairs in the west collaboration area for city staff as well. And we're also working on the Dakota Avenue curb gutter and site utilities. Here's a view from the northeast side of the building. Actually, this was taken last week, and we have gotten more of the brick up on that side of the building. Here's a view from the other side, from the Minnesota Avenue side. You can start to get a pretty good sense of what the exterior of the building is going to look like. Next steps will be the installation of the structural glass walls. So now we're talking about in the atrium area itself. We will be doing brick and stair installation at the north and south stairwells, so these will be for the city staff to utilize. And of course, drywall and painting. To give you a sense of where we're at in terms of the budget, we are on budget. To date, we have expended $8.3 million. So we have 13.5, almost 13.6 remaining in the budget at this point. We'll plan to be back here in March to give you our next quarterly update. And with that, that's my presentation today, unless you have any questions.
Thank you, Director. Any questions for the Director? Councilor Erpenbach.
Just one quick question, Sue. Thanks for being here and reporting for us. Can you remind us, are we using precast concrete on this project?
We are not. Correct, Mark? Do you want to come answer the question?
Mark Cotter, the Office of Public Works. There are elements of the building that are precast, so between essentially the roof of the garage, if you walk through, the industry term is called double T's, and so those are all precast. As the building goes up from there, it's a steel structured building, and then they put what they call metal pans on where the floors will go, and then they pour the concrete to make that floor. But the actual differentiator between the ceiling of the garage and the floor of first floor, that's all precast.
Okay, so then if, because there's underground parking as well, do we pour those walls? Are they poured concrete or are they precast, those walls?
Like the center columns downstairs, when you look down there, those are all precast. But essentially when you excavate that underground parking area, they pour a series of footings, so all that is poured in place concrete. And then where we can, we put precast columns in, and then there's the precast elements, or what we call double T's, sit on that columns and beam structure. But then from that point up, and then the outside perimeter of the basement, if you will, is all poured in place concrete. And then from that point up, it's all structural steel, so beams and columns. And then between the beams, if you will, you put a real thick metal down, and then they put the re-steel in, and then they pour those floors. So that very efficient building design. It's also a very quiet building design. But there are elements in this building that are precast.
A little bit of both, though, it sounds like.
Yep.
Good, thank you.
Are there any other? Councilor Selberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. It looks pretty good. Just a quick question. Are there any surprises so far expense-wise? Anything kind of popped up, or any projects that were not quite expected, or is all going according to plan?
It's pretty much going according to plan. The only thing that I can think of that was a little bit disappointing, but it's not ruining us in terms of budget or anything, is that we have had to drill additional wells for our geothermal. But We have done that and have been successful in the additional drills, so we can still do geothermal, thank goodness.
Okay. Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, thank you very much, Director. Appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item is the Annexation Task Force report, and I will be giving a portion of this presentation along with Director Cooper, Director of Planning and Building Services. And I will remain seated here, but during this time I'm going to pass the gavel down to Vice Chair Erickson, and so she'll carry on from this point forward. And with your, do not listen to Councilor Rolfing. With your permission, I will begin.
Go ahead, Counselor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by reading basically the same statement that I read at our very first meeting 8 months ago, almost 8 months ago, in the public library. I've changed it just a little bit just because the meetings are in the past, so I've made some adjustments considering that. The Annexation Task Force was formed to offer suggestions to the City Administration and the City Council on how to improve the annexation process in Sioux Falls. This task force did not address specific properties or subdivisions in and around Sioux Falls. It was never the intention of the task force to consider specific properties or subdivisions for annexation. Once again, our goal was to improve the process and to provide guidelines that are fair and equitable to all. Furthermore, if individuals or subdivisions have an existing pre-annexation agreement, the work this task force performed was not intended to alter their existing agreement. And I'll add it has not. The task force included 3 city council members as well as 4 citizen members who I will introduce to you in a moment. 4 citizen members of the community who have been a part of the annexation process in one form or another. It was our goal to take as much time as needed to ensure we produce an effective and fair process. Originally, we envisioned 5 meetings and then ended up conducting 8 meetings over a 7-month period of time. The task force considered issues such as incentives intended to mitigate the financial costs to families and properties associated with annexation, what criteria should be used to identify properties for city-initiated annexation, and how should they be prioritized. We considered basic infrastructure standards for existing subdivisions annexed into the city. Several topics were identified for discussion. These topics were discussed during the 8 meetings conducted over the 7-month period. Task force meetings were open and transparent. Public input was conducted at almost every meeting, including an open house at the downtown library. The open house was the second to last meeting and was dedicated to nothing but public input. The open house was conducted in an open and informal process. The City of Sioux Falls website included news releases, meeting packets, meeting video recordings, and a link for public comments. A link was provided on the city's homepage as well as in other areas of the website to make it easy to access task force related information. The task force meetings were relocated from the downtown library to Carnegie Town Hall to better accommodate people interested in attending. Only the first meeting and the open house were conducted at the library. All meetings, with the exception of the first meeting, were broadcast on CityLink and live streamed online. Meetings were recorded and made available on the city website so individuals unable to attend a meeting could view the meeting at a later date. After the first 2 p.m. meeting, the meetings were scheduled at 5:30 p.m. to better accommodate the schedules of those who work during the day. We did all we could to make the meetings open, transparent, and accessible to all who wish to attend or view the proceedings. Once again, this task force did not address or propose annexations of specific properties or subdivisions in and around Sioux Falls. Only this city council has the authority to address annexation. It was not a role of the task force. The purpose of this afternoon's presentation is to brief the full city council about the task force recommendations. We feel our recommendations are an improvement to the overall process of annexations. The task force's recommendations will be brought forward as a resolution for your consideration on Tuesday, December 12th at our 7 o'clock city council meeting. In conclusion, the goal of this task force was to identify a process that not only assists the city in the planning and the coordination of services, but it was important we identified a process that's fair to all. So that's how I basically started our first meeting. And like I said, there was just some slight changes to reflect that all those meetings were in the past tense. So if Jim, if you'd want to go ahead and start the PowerPoint, and I think this is probably behind. But anyway, task force members, our citizen members, and I know that we have a few of you here, so the citizen members that were here, please stand as I call your name. Jeff Davis, Tina Haraldson, Greg Starnes, and Matt Metzger. I know Jeff and Matt are both here. And before I go on with the city council members, I want to take additional time to thank Jeff and Matt, as well as Tina and Greg, who could not be here today, for taking time out of their busy schedules, because both of these gentlemen present today and the others who are not present, they have full-time jobs as well as other members on this council. And so they took their time out for 8 meetings, and it didn't require just the time during the meetings, but it required much time in between meetings, analyzing information and being prepared for that next meeting, and also preparing for our final recommendations. So Jeff and Matt, thank you very much for being here this evening, or this afternoon, and that goes to Tina and Greg as well. Thank you very much for your participation. It was greatly appreciated. And our city council members included myself, who chaired the meetings, Councilor Selberg participated, and Councilor Neitzer. And gentlemen, I'd like to also thank you too for the extra time that you spent above your normal duties as council members, because I know you also have full-time jobs, and I appreciate the extra time and effort. Okay, the public communications efforts. Some of this will be a little bit redundant from what I just read to you, my opening remarks, but I want to cover it anyway here. All meetings were open to the public. A press release was sent out prior to every meeting. And with exception of the first meeting and the open house, all meetings were held here at the Carnegie Town Hall, recorded and live streamed, as I'd already mentioned. Agendas were mailed and emailed to interested parties, and handouts, maps, and presentations from the meetings were posted to the Annexation Task Force webpage on the city website. So it was our attempt to make this as visible and transparent as we possibly could do. So again, I'd like to thank everybody who assisted in doing this as well and managing our website, because there was quite a bit of information that was posted over that 7-month period of time. Okay, the task force goals. To improve, as I've mentioned, to improve the annexation process, to address the unannexed pockets of land being created through petitioned annexations, and many of us on this council had expressed some concerns over that as we dealt with those different issues during city council meetings, and to establish guidelines to assist city staff in determining when they should move forward with a city-initiated annexation. As I mentioned previously, we had a number of meeting topics, and Director Cooper is now going to take over at this point in time, and he will cover the meeting topics as well as what was concluded or what our recommendations are. Director Cooper, thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and thank you for your time commitment, as well as the commitment of your staff, Deborah Gajkowski and Elbert Schmidt, who are sitting over here on the side. Thank you very much for the hard work that all of you have invested.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services. This was probably one of the most unique task force processes that I've been involved with, not only because of the interest that was brought to us by the public, but also just the way that we went about putting together this report. And as a reminder, the full report is available on the city website that will be discussed next Tuesday night at the city council meeting, and that will also allow for additional public comment at that time. So my intent today is to go through a very quick overview of some of the highlights in terms of recommendations that came out of the task force report, and then hopefully answer any questions that you might still have or that other members of the task force could answer as well. As you heard from the introduction, we spent a lot more time on this than we originally anticipated, but I think it was very well that we did that extra time. So we went through, to start with, the different annexation statutes. We talked about petitioned or voluntary annexations that are provided by state law, and then we also talked about city-initiated annexations and what that process involves in terms of an annexation report, the different notifications and public hearings that would be required before something would end up going to a city council vote. We talked a lot about some historical background of city-initiated annexations in the past, including the design standards that property owners were held to. Areas such as Hayward, Orchard Heights, Norton Froelich, and those particular neighborhoods in most cases were existing rural residential subdivisions. Some of them were on sanitary districts or being served by sanitary districts. Some of them were on wells or rural water. But I think in almost all cases when they were annexed, they were done so to convert over to city water and sewer. That was kind of the benefit that they were looking for of being annexed. And in most cases as well, the streets within those subdivisions were allowed to be maintained as what we call rural section. So they were not required initially to put in curb and gutter or sidewalks. And I think in most of those neighborhoods, if you drive around today, there's still the rural section roads that are asphalt. We looked at this map that we had put together to initiate this whole discussion with the city council of 50-some properties that are within the city boundaries as far as pockets or islands or out on the edge of the future growth area. And that was something that we wanted to start with because we wanted to let everybody know that this list of properties has continued to grow in recent years. And we as staff came forward and said, how do you want us to address these in the future? Give us some guidance, give us some direction on what to tell property owners, what to tell neighborhoods, and how we should either initiate or not initiate going forward with discussions about potential annexation. And I think going back to the goals of the task force, that's one of the really good outcomes that we did, I believe, get some direction that we'll talk about here in a little bit. We also talked about capital improvement projects. As we explained to the citizens, we have a 5-year capital program that includes roads, utilities, parks, fire stations, those major types of infrastructure that at some point will impact property owners that are in the city limits or potentially property owners that are not in the city limits. And we felt that that was important type of information so that going forward, again, we would have the ability to communicate with property owners about what those potential major city investments might be and the timing of them. We talked about special assessment statutes. Danny Brown, also want to recognize him for helping us go through some of the statutes as far as how does a municipality assess property when it's annexed or when it's in the city limits for whatever improvements are going to be considered, whether it's utilities or whatever that might be. We felt that that was important too because we had a lot of discussion about the potential standards that we would be using for annexations and what the potential financial impacts would be. So that's the next topic. We spent a lot of time. Probably the public expressed as much interest in this as anything else is the financial impacts of annexation to a property owner. And one of the things that we heard quite often was, what's the benefit to us of being in the city of Sioux Falls? And we heard that, we understood that. It's not an easy one to quantify in all cases because every situation is a little different. But we did talk about the differences between unannexed and annexed property in terms of how those property taxes are spent for law enforcement, for health, for code enforcement, for whatever it might be, street maintenance, utility services. And we talked about the differences between, say, a rural water system and a municipal water service, or a septic system and a city sanitary sewer system. We also talked about the differences within our engineering design standards, and that led us to one of the recommendations, again, that I'll go through is looking at the difference between a typical new subdivision versus an existing rural neighborhood and what those requirements would be with annexation. Our engineering design standards identifies what those requirements are in terms of curb and gutter, street width, water, sewer, storm drainage, all the infrastructure standards that a developer typically would be putting in with a new subdivision. And we talked about maybe we should look at a different model or a different standard for these existing rural subdivisions if they do eventually become part of the city limits. And that kind of goes back to the historical discussion about some of those older neighborhoods that were annexed in the 70s and 80s or even in the 90s, and they were allowed to be annexed without going to an urban type design standard requirement. Another important factor was the Americans with Disabilities Act. That is a big one for municipalities across the country, across the state. And Sioux Falls has become very aggressive just within the last year or two about looking at complying with those standards and actually going back and retrofitting existing streets, existing curb and gutter to comply with those requirements. And we had a lot of discussion about if property is annexed that does not have sidewalk, is there a point in time that they would be required to have sidewalk? It's one of these that there's not a specific black and white answer. There's a little bit of gray matter sometimes, but we did talk about initially rural subdivisions could be annexed without requirements for sidewalk. The city would not initiate that, but there could be a time in the future that some property owner, some neighbor, some citizen could look at wanting to have a sidewalk system within those neighborhoods. So the ADA one is that it's kind of there. We don't know for sure if and when, but it could at some point in the future become a requirement for sidewalk. Then we talked a lot about if a developer, property owner petitions the city, like normally happens, for annexation because of their interest in developing, and that petitioned annexation is going to potentially create a new pocket or a new peninsula or a new island how should we address that? Should we say, no, you can't petition, you cannot bring that in until that pocket or that island is addressed? And again, one of the recommendations that we'll talk about from the task force is that we should continue on to encourage developers to talk to their adjacent property owners or to phase in their petitioned annexation so that it limits those new pockets or those new islands. But we should not start out by saying, no, you're not allowed to even petition and go through the review process. We also talked about later on with communication that we should do a better job of notifying surrounding property owners when a petition annexation comes forward, just so they're aware of it. Then we talked a lot about annexation criteria, and that gets back to one of the goals to start out with of, okay, when we have these existing annexation areas that are not specifically being addressed in terms of city-initiated process, are there some standards, are there some criteria that we can use going forward to at least provide some what we call triggers that would potentially begin that process? And how would we use those triggers to give staff, property owners, anybody else some idea of criteria that would be used going forward, so that we knew more upfront of what that process would be. And then the notifications and communications, spent a lot of time talking about how we can better, as I've kind of already said in a couple situations, let people know what's going on, whether there's a petition annexation or a potential city-initiated annexation or major capital program project going forward, or even neighbors that have an existing pre-annexation agreement. So we covered a lot of territory with those different meetings, and we get to the final recommendations that are being presented in the task force report. And again, that full report is on the city website so that anybody wants to look at it in more detail than what I'm showing you this afternoon can certainly go back and look at that. So starting out under communications, the primary recommendations from the task force is that we should begin some regular notification of property owners that currently are involved with pre-annexation agreements so that we can keep them aware of those agreements. And that came about as we discussed. Some of these pre-annexation agreements have been in place for some time. Property ownership changes so that new property owners may not be aware that there isn't a pre-annexation agreement within their neighborhood, or when these deadlines are coming up that are in the pre-annexation agreement. So the recommendation is that we would have some type of regular notification of these property owners to remind them of that these agreements are on file and what the agreements include. We also talked about a notification process for unannexed property. When a petitioned annexation, or even in the future, if there's going to be a city-initiated annexation, comes forward to the city council, that we should begin a process of notifying adjacent property owners, just so they know that that potential annexation is coming forward. Currently, when there's a petition annexation, we do not have any notification process at all to anybody other than the different agencies or organizations that are involved in the staff review that goes to the city council. Another recommendation was that we should initiate, and I would say maybe continue to be more aggressive as far as proactive meetings regarding future road projects or other infrastructure capital projects. And this goes back to that CIP process of letting people know that if there's going to be a road project or a water or sewer project or some other major city investment in the next 2 to 3 years, that they should be aware of that. There was some discussion about maybe going out more than 5 years, but our CIP only goes out 5. And as you know, being on the council, Once you get out beyond that, even second to third year, sometimes those projects can change or the timeline can change. So probably focus on that first, second year to be more aggressive. And I'll just mention as an example of that, tonight in T, there's a public meeting on the I-29 85th Street project that the city and the DOT are working on with the environmental assessment. And that has the potential to impact a number of property owners along 85th Street and that whole southwest part of Sioux Falls. So we're having a proactive open house and letting people know about the environmental assessment. Public Works has done a number of these open houses historically, and we would continue to look at these going forward as well. But just making sure that people that are within those potential impact areas, whether they're in the city or not in the city, would be able to find out about those projects and the timing of them. And then finally, if there's a city-initiated annexation that would eventually come to the council, that there would be a process that would be presented that staff would have the ability to assure or document that the impacted property owners were notified in accordance with the state law, the city ordinances, and that they were aware and responded to those notifications, so that there's no question that by the time something would come to a public meeting at the council level, that the affected property owners would be aware and would be noticed and would respond to that notice, so that there's no question about that or no surprise. City-initiated annexation criteria was a big one. As I said earlier, one of the main outcomes, I think, of this task force is that it's going to give us some direction about, in the future, when city staff would even potentially start discussions about annexation. And in the recommendations, the task force came up with a number of criteria, or triggers, as we called them a little bit. And I'll just paraphrase those. The first one is that the unannexed property is 100% surrounded by city limits and land that's fully developed. And we even talked about the definition of what fully developed means. So the task force reviewed that and came up with a definition of fully developed. So that would be the starting point. 100% surrounded by city limits and development. Then we talked about additional triggers or criteria that we could use. The unannexed property is currently adjacent to an improved city street, which most likely would be an arterial street, although it could potentially be a collector street, and that property is connected to city water or sewer. In the past, we have allowed connections to city utilities for property that's not annexed. And one of the things that we're talking about going forward is looking at that policy as well, so that that may help us prevent or eliminate additional pockets or islands going forward. Another criteria is that the unannexed property will potentially be impacted by a capital improvement project, such as a street improvement or utility extensions, which would be the most common type of infrastructure. A good example would be if we're redoing an existing rural section line from a 2-lane asphalt or a 2-lane gravel to a 4 or 5-lane urban street with curb and gutter, with water and sewer. How is that going to impact property owners that maybe are not currently in the city limits? How is that going to impact right-of-way, access points, and maybe even future potential land uses? So that would be another potential criteria that we would look at first. Another one was that there could be potentially be a public health or safety issue that could be corrected by bringing the property into the city limits. And I think historically that would be if the property owners want to upgrade their septic systems and replace those with city sewer, or if they want to replace wells or even rural water with municipal water systems, which has more fire protection, maybe more improvements than what they have had in the past. That could potentially fall under that criteria. If their septic systems were failing in a worst-case situation and they needed to convert those septic systems to a city sanitary sewer. And then finally, another criteria is that there's no reasonable means for the city to physically access a property that's adjacent to an unannexed property other than through that unannexed property or through right-of-way. So that discussion, there's some maps that we put up on the screen to kind of help describe or understand what those scenarios might be. So developer is looking at voluntarily petitioning their property into the city. It meets all the criteria. It's in the growth area. It's one that we can get utility services or road improvements to. But in order to do that, we have to extend some improvement either through or adjacent to an unannexed property that's adjacent to that property that's being annexed. So would that be a potential trigger or criteria that we would use in addition to these others that we might initiate an annexation process? So we tried to, I should say, the task force tried to put together a number of different scenarios without getting real specific because every case is going to be different. And we couldn't be very specific in terms of getting too specific about each one of these criteria, but we tried to list them or include them so that you would package them together and that would be a potential starting point. And it doesn't mean that you would end up, but it does mean that you could potentially begin having some discussions with property owners if some of those criteria were starting to be addressed by the city. The next one is allowing minimum standards for infrastructure improvements. And this goes back to the engineering design standards discussion. And I think one of the breakthroughs, if I'll call that we had at least one or two of the task force meetings was when we presented the option of the typical urban versus a typical rural street section. And Mark Cotter is here as our Director of Public Works, and his team helped address some of this and answer questions about that. So going forward, if an existing rural subdivision was proposed to be annexed either voluntarily or by the city-initiated process, is there an avenue that they could be allowed to continue with their gravel or their rural section roads, and even on a limited time with their rural water and septic systems? And so in the recommendations by the task force, we've outlined what those minimum improvements could be. And I think that can really be beneficial going forward as we address some of these areas, much like historically how we dealt with some of those existing rural neighborhoods when they wanted to be brought into the city limits to get water and sewer, but maybe not necessarily to be required to have the full street width with curb and gutter. Another big item was we should consider the financial impact of annexation on property owners prior to proceeding with a city-initiated annexation. We heard a lot, not only from the task force, but from the public. Again, what's the benefit to us of being annexed? What's the financial impact going to be if we would be annexed on property taxes, as well as potential assessments for improvements? And that's really what led the task force and city staff of going back and looking at allowing these minimum standards as what I would call a pretty major financial concession to potential property owners that would be brought into the city limits. And again, people would ask, okay, give me the specific differences between a typical block of city urban versus rural, what that different cost is going to be to property owners. And the best that we could do would be to give you a range, because every situation can be different depending on what we start with. If we start with gravel, or if we start with 2 lanes of asphalt, depending on where that water and sewer infrastructure might go, how much disruption that's going to be to the properties. So we can't give you a specific quantity, but we can, we can talk about the range of cost. And the property tax revenue was one that we also talked about through the meetings and from the public input, that if people's property taxes are going to go up automatically, 30%, I think on average, a little over 30%, how are those taxes going to be used? And if there's some potential cost savings to the city with those annexed properties, could that be reflected within potential future assessments? And then also that we should look at taking into consideration the assessed value of property when determining what those potential special assessment costs might be. Again, most of the rural residential subdivisions are on large lots as opposed to a typical city lot. And so the financial impact of converting to even city water and sewer can be much larger than it would be for a typical urban lot. And even though we're talking about having some flexibility with those future minimum standards, again, as part of the analysis that we would be required to go through with a city-initiated annexation, there's a very specific list of criteria that we would be going through that includes what's the financial impacts to the city to provide services to these potential annexed areas, and then what are going to be the financial impacts to the annexed areas. All that is part of the requirements by state law of that annexation study report that would be presented to a city council in the future. But we heard from the citizens, we heard from the task force, let's make sure that we put a little more detail, or put more detail into the financial impact, part of that potential annexation analysis. And then finally, as I mentioned, we had some discussion about the definition of terms, fully developed versus development versus impacted versus adjacent, and how those would be incorporated into some of the recommendations that are in the full task force report. So a lot of territory was covered, and I think we started back in April with our first meeting. So again, I'm here tonight just as one person to talk about this, and I'm looking forward to the full presentation at next Tuesday's council meeting. So I'll just stop right there and turn it back to Councilor Kiley.
Thank you. I just have a few closing remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Council Vice Chair Erickson for the question portion. The Annexation Task Force report, and that is this report. All of the council members have this, and I know we had a few copies available for the public, not enough for everybody, but this is available on SIRE as well as on the city website. At the same location, all of our Annexation Task Force related information has been located. So that report, and I might state that the executive summary, pages 1 and 2, go into the details that Director Cooper just presented during the last part of his presentation. So it's kind of a great synopsis of our recommendations. And the task force recommendation will be brought forward as a resolution for the council's consideration on Tuesday, December 12th. So more discussion will take place amongst ourselves at that point in time, and public input will take place at that point in time as well, as is the procedure for resolutions. And then lastly, but not least, I'd like to thank all of the citizens who participated, who took time out of their schedules as well to participate and offer their input during the meetings, because there are many of you that are present here this afternoon that attended every one of our meetings over that 7-month period. So to the citizens that are here this afternoon, I thank you too for your input and for your participation. At this point, turn it over to Council Vice Chair Erickson.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, to you and Director Cooper. At this point, I'll entertain questions from the council or statements. Any questions or statements from the council? Councilor Erpenbach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of clarifications, if I could. Question about the requirement or the not requirement for sidewalks. Mr. Cooper, can you, or Mr. Brown, could you clarify for me, the recommendation says, if required by ADA. Can you talk about what that might mean to us? I mean, my neighborhood has all sidewalks, right? And so I'm just wondering, how does that relate for my potential new neighbors?
Well, Danny Brown from the City Attorney's Office. I guess what we're going for there is if the feds come in and say you need to have sidewalks because the ADA requires it because of connectivity issues within your community, either now or in the future, then that's a requirement that will have to be abided by and conformed with. And so presently, if there's not a requirement that it be in place, you haven't heard from the ADA or the feds or from us, then you'll be able to keep the absence of those sidewalks. But if there comes a time when there is a claim and there is an issue and it comes to the attention of the city or the federal government and there's some requirement that they be put in place, then it's something that might happen. We can't control, the city can only control what it can control. And at this point, it's not trying to make those folks put in sidewalks, but if there is a connectivity issue, it could be something that's required later.
Because we do have neighborhoods that are inside city limits now that don't have sidewalks, and I assume they won't ever. Columbia Heights is an example over by the VA. And we're, the only way, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, the only way that they might be forced to put sidewalks into that area, for instance, would be if perhaps someone with some sort of physical impairment filed some kind of claim and said, no, I can't get where I need to go, and they file a complaint and then we have to put sidewalks in there? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that, and I'm also saying, and I would like to say that, you know, those requirements are pretty complicated when you have to put in sidewalks and when you don't have to put them in, and complying with federal regulations, and federal regulations change from time to time. So there could be other issues too that provoke or require those sidewalks to be put in. But essentially you're correct. Unless there's a claim or unless we know that they need to be in for a reason, they're not going to be required to be put in at this time.
So then can you clarify for us or remind us what it means when this is coming only as a resolution, it's not coming as an ordinance? What kind of teeth does a resolution have for those areas that are being considered for annexation?
Well, the resolution is basically policy and it's guidance for city administration to move forward with whatever action it brings. Ultimately, any sidewalk requirement and annexation requirement is going to have to be approved by City Council. So when you pass your resolution and you make a policy recommendation, you're getting the city staff an idea and guidance on what you folks are going to be willing to listen to and what you're potentially going to consent to and what you're going to agree with. So that helps all the folks out there know that there is a policy in place, that these are their marching orders, and if they follow these marching orders, most likely the City Council will go along with it. But if they don't, and the city staff presents something that's not consistent with those policies, then most likely it's going to be turned away because it's inconsistent.
I might, one more, Madam Chair. I'm afraid I might be muddying the waters, and it might just be my own brain right now, but by saying that sidewalks are optional, like we are in this one, are we setting ourselves up for those developers who are in the process of maybe developing a new neighborhood in inside annexed areas? Are we setting ourselves up to say, oh yeah, sidewalks are optional for you too? Or are they going to argue with us if we say, for some areas, sidewalks are optional? Is there an issue there that I'm maybe not understanding?
Well, I think the sidewalks are optional are going to be for the rural developments that are in the city limits already. New development is going to be tougher not to abide by that standard.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's the distinction. Thanks.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Staley.
Well, first of all, I wanted to reiterate the thank you to those individuals who were on the task force, and I was able to attend many of those meetings, and I was so impressed with the quality of dialogue, debate, commentary that came forth, independent thinking. It was wonderful. And I also want to say thank you to Councillor Kiley, because you were open to input as I attended those meetings. And I'm also really grateful that you were willing to change the venue from a downtown library on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock to a public building where you don't have to pay for parking at a 5:30 time. So I think that attributed a lot to the amount of resident participation we had. So I've got a few questions here. If maybe Mike Cooper would come up. So throughout all this, and I'm thinking that at the end of the day, we haven't really changed a lot. Is that, I mean, we've formalized a few things, but a lot of things are probably the same as they were.
Oh, I would say, I think with this recommendation, I think we've changed a lot. I think we've changed, number one is that we have, again, criteria to use that gives us some guidance of whether or not we're even going to approach the public or citizens. In the past, we put together these maps and we just went out on our own and started having discussions with neighborhoods about annexation without any criteria. And then we discovered that we didn't know what to tell them at the end of the day as far as what those criteria would be. So I think that to me is the number one outcome, is that when you look at those lists of criteria or triggers, that's big, that's huge. The second thing is giving the option of the rural engineering design standards. We never had that before. We never discussed that in the past as an option.
Right, but we haven't had a city-initiated annexation for a long time either, correct?
Well, we had one that we brought to you a while back and it got stopped.
Well, exactly.
For one property
Matt
owner.
Metzger is what kind of lit the fire on this. But look, let's talk about a Prairie Meadows situation. What has been put into the task force, to the resolution, that is going to help you to help us to have a guideline to deal with them?
Oh, again, I would just say,
A problematic area like
Sure.
that would.
so in the case of an existing rural subdivision like that, that's having discussions about maybe updating or replacing some of their existing infrastructure. Early on, the debate centered on, okay, the cost of annexation was going to be tremendous to property owners, because we were talking about the typical city street with curb, gutters, sidewalks, streetlights, all those. And that just got us off to the wrong, or to the debate that didn't lead us down the path of any consensus. Now, with the recommendations that are in this task force report, we could potentially go back and have a new discussion about, here's what we could do to gradually bring you into the city at a much lower cost and less financial impact. We never had that before.
Okay. And my understanding just with the Prairie Meadows situation is that physically, for them to upgrade their sewer system is going to be very expensive. So there's still the debate about who's going to bear the brunt of that cost. But that's for another issue. Second thing,
Go ahead, Councillor.
second point. I had heard some discussion that there was a subdivision that was discussing a no annexation agreement with you. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, the idea of a no annexation agreement that basically would commit the city to not initiating any annexation for a very extended period of time, was reviewed by the city attorney's office and was determined that we don't have the legal authority to enter into an agreement like that.
And wasn't that like a 40-year?
I think it was actually a 50-year.
Okay, so is there room for, because part of the problem I see with these areas is that, and I think now we've established we're not going to be moving on anybody in the near future. Is
Yes.
that, okay.
And again, if you look at that list of criteria, if you go through those and put them together, I think it's pretty clear that we would not be approaching these neighborhoods like we had done in the past.
So I think I can empathize with them wanting to say, if we could give them, and look at this, maybe look at this again after the new administration takes over, but to say, we're going to give you a 15-year no annexation agreement, or some kind of a definite time period where if they're trying to sell their homes, they don't have this annexation thing hanging over their heads, because I think that could jeopardize, a sale.
Sure, and we've done, another option was to do a pre-annexation agreement, because a no annexation agreement really doesn't end up with anything. It ends up with no agreement. At least with a pre-annexation agreement, it gives you some kind of a time frame if there was a desire to do something like that with a neighborhood.
And leading in, that was my next question, the pre-annexation agreement, I know like Pine Lake Hills, there was some confusion as to when that was going to expire, and some people thought they were protected, and some people were told they weren't. Explain to us how that's going to be working, like does Prairie Meadows have a pre-annexation agreement?
So the pre-annexation agreements that are currently in place, one of the recommendations that I went through with the task force is that we need to go back and proactively begin meeting with all of those neighborhoods, all those property owners that are within a pre-annexation agreement, and make them aware of what that agreement includes, the time frame, which properties are affected by those, so that the public is better or more aware of those existing pre-annexation
And then
agreements.
could they renegotiate at that time? Is that something that's still
Yes.
pliable? That
Yes.
they, okay, and I have two more, but I'm willing to, if somebody else-
I'll come back around to you. Councilor Neitzer.
Just a very quick comment. I just wanted to clarify, in addition to this resolution, there may be ordinances that may come forward that we can codify some of those recommendations.
Yes.
So some of it is just guidance for the administration that isn't really appropriate as a ordinance, but there's some very specific items that we can make changes to certain standards.
Thank you. Councilor Selberg, did you have?
Yeah, just a quick statement. I don't know that I have any questions. Just kind of a couple of comments. Being a part of this process, it's been quite a long process. We started in the spring and wrapped up just short of having to plan a Christmas party, so we were at this quite a while, and I think everybody did a nice job. It's certainly a complex issue. There were no easy answers and no one-size-fits-all, and that was what really made it complex and tough. I think we did exercise due diligence. Nothing was rushed in this process. I think we spent 6 months worth of meetings and countless hours on the subject to come up with these recommendations. The goal was to refine and help improve the system. I think we did that. And I think there's work to be done from here. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to make a statement of, a couple of kudos to pass out that maybe it'll be, I'm repeating what's already been said, but kudos to Councilor Chair Kiley for your stewardship on this and keeping us on the right path. I think a lot of times we were kind of moving off in a few different directions, and you kind of kept us on goal, and kind of it was essential, and citizens were very involved, and that's terrific. But I think a lot of times yet people kept thinking we were out to make decisions and annexation decisions, which we weren't. We were here to just establish some guidelines and offer some advice. So you kind of kept that on the straight and narrow. So nice job. And then to the citizen volunteers, I know a couple are here I'm looking at, their insight and input was excellent. And it was a very good idea having them be a part of this. So in general, I think it's a good step forward. There's work to be done, and thanks to you, Director Cooper, and your staff for all your help too. So thank you.
Any other statements, questions?
I was just going to comment a little bit in addition to Councilor Staley, your question about the think it was actually a 49-year no annexation agreement proposal. That was not a part of the annexation task force. That was not presented to us, and it was not dealt with by the annexation task force. That was dealt with strictly by Director Cooper and his team.
Mr. Starr, did you have any questions before I move to Councilor Staley? Councilor Staley, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Director Cooper. So then I've got three more things. Totally surrounded, 100% surrounded, just to clarify, that would not mean farmland. That has to have some residential development
Yes,
or business?
It would be a combination of the city limits completely surrounds the property and that there's actually development around the property. Not just farmland.
Oh, excellent. 75% approval, they used to have, explain the 75% thing, where you'd get your neighborhood on board.
That's the requirement that's outlined by state law for in order for an annexation to go forward, there has to be 75%. If you don't meet that 75%, then that would potentially trigger a city-initiated annexation.
Okay, so that's
for the
there,
voluntary,
okay.
yes.
And then there was some talk about, and I don't know if it got put into writing about the septic system. Did we come to some kind of consensus about how long people could keep their septic tanks?
I think as long as it was meeting the requirements of a properly functioning septic system.
Once they're annexed, so they could still have that. And are there septic systems within the city limits
I think
now?
there's maybe a handful, Mark? 12, okay, more than a handful.
Okay.
So we've gradually tried to phase those out, but yes, there are still some
Thank
on a
you.
limited basis.
Councilor Ralphie.
Yeah, Director, I heard Councilor Staley say that we're looking at these pre-annexation contracts, and she indicated, well, if we can do a 15-year pre-annexation contract with somebody, that'll give them time to either sell their house or save the money and do that kind of thing to get up to date. But then she mentioned something about then they could be renegotiated. Seems like if we sign a contract on pre-annexation and we can go back and renegotiate it, it's like the first contract meant nothing.
Yes, but I was just trying to answer factually that any contract could potentially be renegotiated. It doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that it would have to be or that will be, but
Or that the
it could
city
be.
would
Yes.
agree to,
Yes.
if everybody agreed to the first contract, we would not be forced to go in and renegotiate
But
it.
there's options, and I'm not a contract lawyer, but yes, it could
That'd
be.
be,
I'm just saying that is a possibility. I'm not saying that it could or should be done,
okay.
or that I'm not saying that it should be done in all cases.
What will not be an automatic
Is
thing?
that, yes,
Am I
Is the
right,
situ-
Danny?
okay, okay.
And it is a situation where now, because of, especially with our acceptance of rural standards versus our city engineered standards of sidewalk, curb and gutter and everything else, that there's some conditions that are probably more favorable for those subdivisions, and it would be in their interest to approach that.
Got it.
And we do have that flexibility now.
Any other questions, comments from the council? I'll just say I have one question. I'm just curious if any of these changes require any state legislative change, or if we can operate within just our ability right now, or if we will need any changes at the state level at any point going forward through this to allow more flexibility and local control.
Yeah, none of these proposed recommendations would require a change to state law.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just echo many of the statements that were said earlier. I'm so grateful for the time that so many put in. You know, as a council, we often do these task force and we kind of divide and conquer our group, our elected body here, to address topics such as this, as others in the past and others in the future. And so I'm grateful for those that spent your time doing this on the behalf of the council, as well as all the staff and also all the citizens of the area. I know you're not all in the city limits, and that's the point of you being here, is to have your voice heard. And so thank you for being here. Please stay engaged and continue to contact us if you have other questions or concerns or any of that. That's why this process works, is when we work together. So thank you so much. If there's nothing else, I will adjourn the 4 o'clock. Thank you.